Hello everyone, this is my presentation on the topic CSS corners, borders, and shadows. So first of all, let's start with the question, what are corners, borders, and shadows in CSS? Corners give a rounded effect to your CSS styling using the border radius property. Borders can add different lines around your CSS stylings using the border style property. Shadows create a drop shadow effect on text and elements using the text shadow or box shadow properties. The CSS border radius property defines the radius of an element's corners and rounds the corners of an element's outer border edge. The border radius property can have from 1 to 4 values. Here is the example and how it works. 4 values. First value applies to top left corner. Second value applies to top right corner. Third value applies to bottom right corner. And fourth value applies to bottom left corner. 3 values. First value applies to top left corner, second value applies to top right and bottom left corners, and third value applies to bottom right corner. 2 values. First value applies to top left and bottom right corners, and the second value applies to top right and bottom left corners. 1 value. The value applies to all 4 corners, which are rounded equally. We may also specify the radiuses in which the corner is rounded by. In other words, the rounding doesn't have to be perfectly circular, it can be elliptical. This is done using a slash between 2 values. The value of border radius property can be specified in percentages when wanting to create a circle or ellipse shape, but can be used anytime you want the border radius to be directly correlated with the element's width. This border radius property for creating a circle shape with a value of 50% can be applied only if the element's width and height are the same. The next slide introduces the border radius property using both percentages and a slash between the values. This is the border radius property using 2 percentage values and a slash between values. The next one is using 4 percentage values and a slash between values. Let's take a closer look at CSS borders. The CSS shorthand border property sets an element's border and specifies the style, width, and color of an element's border using border style, border width, and border color properties. The border style property sets the style of an element's 4 borders. It is always necessary to declare the border style property before the border width property, because an element must have borders before we can set the width. The following values are allowed. Dotted defines a dotted border. Dashed defines a dashed border. Solid defines a solid border. Double stands for a double border. Groove defines a 3D grooved border. The effect depends on the border color value. Rich defines a 3D rich border. The effect depends on the border color value. Inset defines a 3D inset border. The effect again depends on the border color value. Outset defines a 3D outset border. The effect depends on the border color value. There is also one value called none that defines no border and one value called hidden that defines a hidden border. The border width property sets the width of an element's 4 borders. So this example is applying the border property using a keyword value for the border width property, which is thick, and a value for the border style property, which is solid. The next example is applying the border property using a value for the border style property, which is dashed, and a value for the border color property, which is blue. The border color property sets the color of an element's border. And finally, this example is having the border property applying all three properties. The border width property using a numerical value of 10 pixels, the border style property with a value of rich, and the border color property with a value of orange color. The border shorthand property is especially useful when we want all four borders to be the same. To make them different from each other. However, we can use the longhand border width, border style, and border color properties, which accept different values for each side. When one value is specified, it applies the same width or style or color to all four sides, as we have seen in the previous examples. When two values are specified, the first value applies to top and bottom, the second value to the left and right. Here's an example. Border width. Top and bottom borders are thin, right and left borders are medium. Border style. Top and bottom borders are solid, right and left borders are dotted. Border color. Top and bottom borders are red, right and left borders are green. When three values are specified, the first value applies to the top, the second value to the left and right, the third value to the bottom. Here's an example. Border width, top border is thin, right and left borders are medium, bottom border is thick. Border style. Top border is solid, right and left borders are dotted, bottom border is dashed. Border color. Top border is red, right and left borders are green, bottom border is blue. If four values are specified, the values are applied clockwise to the top, right, bottom, and left sides. Here's an example. Border width. Top border is thin, right is medium, bottom border is thick, left border is 10 pixels. Border style. Top border is solid, right border is dotted, bottom border is double, and left border is dashed. Border color. Top border is red, right border is green, bottom is blue, and left border is pink. Okay, so finally, let's find out more about the shadows in CSS. With CSS, we can add shadow to text and to elements using the text shadow and box shadow properties. Let's start with the text property first. This property is specified as a comma-separated list of shadows. This means that we can add more than one shadow to the text by adding a comma-separated list of shadows. Each shadow is specified as 2 or 3 length values, followed optionally by a color value. The first two values specify the length of the shadow offset. The first value specifies the horizontal distance and the second value specifies the vertical distance of the shadow. The third value specifies the blur radius and the last value describes the color of the shadow. Using positive numbers as the first two values will place the shadow to the right of the text horizontally. That's the first value, and place the shadow below the text vertically. That's the second value. A negative value places the shadow to the left of the text. That's the first value, and place the shadow above the text. That's the second value. If both values are zero value, the shadow is placed directly behind the text. The third value, the blur radius, is an optional value which can be specified but don't have to. It's the amount of pixels the text is stretched, which causes a blur effect. The higher the value, the bigger the blur, the shadow becomes wider and lighter. If you don't use the third value, it is treated as if you specified a blur radius of 0. Here is a first example of basic text shadow using the first two values to specify only a horizontal shadow and a vertical shadow. The second example uses the first two values and a color value. The next example uses all four values in the text shadow property. The third value adds a blur effect. The following example shows a red and blue neon glow shadow by using a comma-separated list of shadows to add more than one shadow to the text. There are many other examples of using the text shadow property. For example, we can change the color of the text itself and add a text shadow property. Now let's see how to use the Box Shadow property. The Box Shadow CSS property adds shadow effects around an element's frame. We can set multiple effects separated by commas. A box shadow is described by X and Y offsets relative to the element, blur and spread, radius, and color. Similar to the text shadow property, the first value defines the horizontal offset of the shadow. If this value has a positive offset, positive numbers, then the shadow will be on the right of the element. A negative offset will put the shadow on the left of the element. The second value defines the vertical offset of the shadow. A negative offset means the box shadow will be above the box. A positive one means the shadow will be below the box. The third value is the blur radius, which is optional. If set to 0, the shadow will be sharp. The higher the number, the more blurred it will be. The fourth optional value is the spread radius. Positive values increase the size of the shadow, negative values decrease the size. If not specified, it will be 0. The shadow will be the same size as the element. The fifth value is the color. It takes any color value like hex, named, RGBA, or HSLA. If the color value is omitted, box shadows are drawn in the foreground color, text color. But be aware, older WebKit browsers, Pre-Chrome 20 and Safari 6 ignore the rule when color is omitted. Let's see some examples of using Box Shadow property. The first example only specifies the horizontal shadow and the vertical shadow using first two values. The second example is adding a gray color to the shadow by applying first two values and a color value. The next example is adding a blur effect to the shadow by applying first three values and a color value. The third value defines the blur radius of the shadow. This example is applying all five values. The fourth value defines the spread radius of the shadow. The last example is applying multiple shadow effects separated by comma. As we can see, this div element has one blue shadow and one red shadow. In conclusion, I would just like to mention that the CSS border radius property for corners, border property, text shadow, and box shadow properties can be applied together in the same CSS declaration block to the same element selector. And here are the online resources I used for this presentation. Thank you for your attention and feel free to ask any questions.